after the Greeks win these series of Persian wars, these wars against the Persians, they eventually repel them completely in 480 BC at the Battle of Salamis. The Athenians are going to emerge as a very powerful city-state after this. This ushers in this golden age of Athens, this golden age of the Greek Empire, what we know as the Hellenistic ages from the Greek Empire. The Athenian general Pericles is going to rebuild Athens to become the most beautiful city in Greece. These public buildings are fancy. The Athenian homes are very simple. The most famous buildings are going to be built atop the Acropolis. The example of that is in this picture over here, the Parthenon. So this quest for beauty and for meaning, Greek civilization reaches its peak about the mid-400s BC, particularly in Athens. This is known as the Golden Age. The artists create beautiful architecture, sculptures, paintings, and the artistic style is what we call classical. Simple, graceful, balanced. We talked a little bit about what their sculptures are going to look like. They're going to depict what they think the perfect human being looks like. These advancements in philosophy, literature, and drama that we're going to talk about. They will have buildings for the gods that are ornate enough that the gods can live in them. So each city-state tries to turn its Acropolis into an architectural treasure. The Parthenon best exemplifies this Greek architecture, as you see, and every one of them are going to build a building atop their Acropolis, their hill, in their city. And the Greeks didn't need large sanctuaries or places for worship. They worship at home or at outdoor altars, but they had buildings for the gods. So these temples are where the deities are going to live. They're gods. And we've talked about each city-state having a specific god or gods that they pay homage to. So the Greek architects understand illusion and perspective, which is the artistic showing of distances as they appear to the eye. It creates this impression of perfection. And the Greeks are going to be very obsessed with this idea of perfection, not only in art and architecture, but also in the physical appearance of the human beings. So let's talk a little bit about the Greek art. They excelled at portraying the human form, and again, we've already hit on that. Some ancient Greek vases still exist, different shapes for different purposes. The crater, you see up here, a two-handed vase with a wide mouth, good for mixing water and wine. The amphora, a large vase for storing oil and other supplies, decorated with art to show their mythology, their gods. And the kylix, a drinking cup decorated with scenes of everyday life. In the Greek arts, Myron, one of the Greece's famous sculptors, sculpted what he thought people should look like. So he's going to sculpt a discus thrower. Again, the idea of the Olympics, track and field, one of my favorite, does come from the Greek Empire. All right, let's talk about the Greek arts. Phidias, another great Greek sculptor, is going to create statues inside the Parthenon, including one of Athena. Praxiteles, a sculptor who carved more realistic human sculptures. Tried to make those appropriate for you guys. In drama and theater, Greeks are going to be the first to write and perform plays. The earliest Greek plays are called tragedies. And you should know that tragedies are ones that have unhappy endings after the main character struggles against fates. And sometimes those fates are going to be dealing with the gods. Aeschylus, a Greek tragedy writer who wrote 90 plays. It's him depicted over here. His trilogy of plays called Orestia shows how the consequences of one's actions are carried down from generation to generation. And you can look that up if you'd like. The law of community should, not personal revenge, should decide punishment. Sophocles, a general in the Athenian army, he also writes tragedies. He accepted human suffering as an unavoidable part of life. He wrote Oedipus Rex, which deals with King Oedipus' struggle to beat the fates, but he can't win against them. Euripedes, he is going to write tragedies. He hated war, and his plays often show the misery of war, like the bad things about it, and he focuses on human behavior that brings disaster. Some of the comedies had humorous plots and happy endings. Aristophanes, the most famous writer of the Greek comedies. We've already talked about the Olympic Games. The ancient Greeks stressed athletics in school. Greek men often spend their afternoons exercising, and the Olympic Games are held every 4 years in Olympia in honor of Zeus. Um, they will stop for fighting and trade, stopped for the Olympic Games. Only males were allowed to participate. Women weren't even allowed to watch. Just an interesting fact, probably mostly because when the men competed, they didn't wear a lot of clothing. So the Greek women had their own games honoring Hera. In the Olympic Games, individuals, not team events, foot races, broad jumping, discus throwing, boxing, wrestling, a pentathlon, which are 5 events. The winners were crowned with olive leaves, and parades were held in their honor. Olympic athletes often were given special privileges like not having to pay taxes. Pretty sweet deal. In the Greek mind, the Greek philosophers were the thinkers, produced some very remarkable ideas, some that we still refer to today. Their philosophy laid the foundations for history, political science, biology, and logic, which is the science of reasoning. The Sophists, higher education was provided by professional teachers called Sophists. They traveled from city-state to city-state, from polis to polis, but they usually gathered in Athens because there was more freedom of speech there than there were in some of the other city-states. And these teachers said they could find the answers to all the questions. And as students, that'd be awesome, right? So your teacher should just tell you all the answers to all the questions and not make you look for it. Not really. They rejected the idea that gods could influence human behavior. They challenged traditional Greek beliefs, and they believed truth was different for each individual, and you had to find your own individual truth. They were criticized by Socrates and Plato. Let's talk about Socrates. Socrates was a sculptor by trade, but he spent most of his time teaching. He believed in absolute truth versus relative truth, and absolute truth is something that's applied to everybody. Relative truth is something that your truth is true for you, but not necessarily true for me. They were interested in the process by which people learn to think for themselves. He's going to develop a method of teaching called the Socratic Method. He asks students questions, and then he argues with their answers in order to get them to understand why they believe what they believe and for them to own it. And so he forces students to clarify their thoughts and to really own the knowledge that they have. He's accused of corrupting the young and not worshiping Greek gods. Jury finds him guilty and sentences him to death. And he kills himself by drinking poison, and he dies among his followers instead of being put to death by the government. Plato was born an aristocrat. He becomes a teacher and opened an academy. He recorded conversations between Socrates and his followers from memory. He wrote the earliest book on political science, which is a branch of history, or history may be a branch of the social sciences, political science being one of those, called The Republic. It outlines his plan for what he considered an ideal society and government to look like. He's very disliked by the Athenian democracy, for which I'm sure you can tell why, and he prefers the government of Sparta over the Athenian democracy. He said the community should come before the individual. He said too much freedom would result in social disorder. He disliked the lower classes. Remember, he was from that a high aristocratic status. And he thought only the most intelligent and the best educated should participate in government. He rejects the senses as a source of truth, and the real world was constructed from ideas. Aristotle. One more interesting thing to note, if you haven't ever read Plato's Allegory of the Cave, I'm sure at some point in your educational studies you will do that. I got to college before I had to read that. It's not a terrible thing to read, but it kind of gives you an insight into the way that Plato thinks and the way his mind works. All right, moving on. Aristotle. He wrote more than 200 books ranging from astronomy to political science. He starts a school known as the Lyceum. He taught the golden mean, which was to live moderately and to avoid extremes. Some good advice there. Unlike Plato, Aristotle believes that knowledge is gained through the senses. The first person to observe facts, then to classify them into categories and make generalizations. Some of his ideas were incorrect, which an example is that the Earth is the center of the solar system and everything revolves around it. Common mistake at that time. Aristotle compared the political structures in different Greek city-states, and he wrote a book called Politics. An idea form of government is the balance between a monarchy, an aristocracy, and a democracy. And the middle class is the best suited to rule because they know how to command and how to obey. The writers of history. We've already talked about this guy. We'll revisit him again for just a minute. Herodotus, the father of history, wrote about the Persian Wars in his book called Historia. Sometimes accepted statements that weren't true, and he exaggerated numbers. Sometimes he offers supernatural explanations of events. So we have evidence of this from his writings, but we don't know how accurate what he gives us is. Another of these writers of history, just like Herodotus, was Thucydides. He wrote about the Peloponnesian War, which we're going to talk about in just a second. He rejected the idea that deities played a role in history. His writings were accurate, impartial, as far as we know, believed that future generations could learn from the past. The first scientists, Greeks made scientific discoveries through observation and thought. And mathematics, which was seen as a pure science, believed that they could find absolute knowledge through math. Tend to agree there. Thales is going to study astronomy and mathematics. He could foretell a solar eclipse. He said water was a substance for which everything was made. Pretty smart guy. Mathematics. We've already talked about Pythagoras. Remember, he is related to the Pythagorean theorem that you learned about in math. He comes from the Greek Empire. Medicine, we talked about this yesterday. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, believes that diseases had natural causes, the body can heal itself, and he advocates for proper hygiene, like a good diet, plenty of rest, taking care of yourself, and he wrote a code for ethical medical conduct. We still use this today. First, do no harm, that Hippocratic oath. Daily life in Athens. So what was it like? Men worked in the mornings as artisans, farmers, merchants, in their trade, and in the afternoon they attended an assembly or exercised. Slaves were about a third of the population. They did the heavy work in craft production and mining. Many slaves were also teachers and house servants. Slaves were also prisoners of war, foreigners, debtors. Remember, you couldn't be a citizen of Athens unless you were born in Athens. The women stayed at home, cooked, made wool cloth. Poor women worked in markets as food sellers and cloth weavers. The upper class men and men from other city-states participated in symposiums. A symposium was like a drinking session following a banquet, and they discussed public affairs, philosophy, literature, and I'm sure as the night wore on, some of those conversations got pretty interesting. They were entertained by dancers, singers, magicians, and acrobats, so it was kind of like a party for them. The Athenian women had many restrictions, but still some progress there. Many learned to read and write, and many participated in city festivals. Let's talk about the Peloponnesian War. The Persian threat remained even though the Persians lost the Persian Wars. So most city-states, but not Sparta, joined together in a Delian League to protect themselves from the Persians. They freed Ionia from Persian rule. They got rid of the pirates in the Aegean Sea, and they made Greece rich because trade grew. So this Delian League, the Athens began to dominate the other city-states. Several city-states formed an alliance against Athens. This was led by Sparta, Athens' enemy number one. And threatened by Athens' economic and political power and influence, Sparta was afraid and jealous of Athens. The conflict from 431 to 404 BC was the Peloponnesian War, and it was fought between Athens and its allies and Sparta and its allies. So if you see on the map, Athens and Sparta. Sparta allied itself with Persia. They made a deal with them for their help. In 431 to 404 BC, again the conflict, plague is going to hit Athens. It kills a third of their people, including their general Pericles. After Pericles dies, some Athenians want to surrender, and others want to keep fighting. No decisions made, but the fighting continues for many years. Several city-states switch sides and join Sparta, and the Spartans destroy the Athenian navy, and Athens surrenders in 404 BC. What were the effects of this war? Why do we talk about it? The war brought disaster. to the Greek city-states. Fields were destroyed, unemployment was high, populations declined, many men left and became mercenaries or hired soldiers in the Persian army. They lost the ability to govern themselves, increases tension between the aristocrats and the commoners, limited democracy, free political discussion, continual fighting among the city-states, and the inability to resist invasion of the Macedonians. And we know that the great Macedonian king, Alexander the Great, is going to eventually be the one that is going to conquer the Greeks. So the Macedonians descended from the Dorians, which lived just north of Greece, and Greece looked down on them. They saw them as backward mountain people. Philip II becomes king of Macedonia in 359 BC. He's determined to do three things: create a strong army, and he's going to emulate the Greek-style phalanxes, so they're forming fighting, and he unifies the Greeks under Macedonian rule, and to destroy the Persian army. So those are his three goals. He pursues his ambition for the next 23 years. Sometimes he'll conquer a city-state, a polis. Sometimes he bribes the city-state's leader to surrender, and sometimes he makes allies with the polis through marriage. He has a lot of wives. The Greek city-states won't cooperate with one another to fight off the Macedonians. By 338 BC, Philip II had conquered all of Greece except for Sparta. So if you look, this reddish color here is what is held under the Macedonians' leadership. And there's Sparta down there. So just as he was preparing to conquer Persia, Philip II was murdered, possibly by a Persian or an assassin hired by his first wife, Olympias. Olympias and Philip II's son, Alexander the Great, will become king. Fateful decision there. Alexander's conquest. So when he was only 20, he's going to take over the empire. He's highly respected for his courage and his military skill. He's tutored by Aristotle, conquered Persian territories, including Egypt and Mesopotamia, and eventually all the way to India, if you can see over there. Alexander's conquest. He dies at 33, probably of malaria. He wants to unite Europe and Asia under one empire and combine the best of the Greek and Persian cultures. He divides his domain. 3 of Alexander's generals divided his territory into separate domains or territories. Ptolemy is going to rule Egypt, Libya, and part of Syria. So the Ptolemaic Empire is going to be there. Seleucus is going to rule the rest of Syria, Mesopotamia, Iran, and Afghanistan. Forced to give up all by Syria. Lost Jerusalem to the Jews, an event that's now remembered in the Jewish holiday as Hanukkah. Antigonus is going to rule Macedonia and Greece, and it would eventually be conquered by the Romans. This Hellenistic culture that we've talked about from the Greek language and culture spread in the lands of that Alexander had conquered. This Greek way of life mixed with the Persian culture of the Middle East to form a new culture, this Hellenistic culture, and it was concentrated in cities. The largest and wealthiest city was Alexandria in Egypt. Had a double harbor with a lighthouse, the first ever museum, a large library, scientific research institute, zoo, and botanical garden. And it was here that Jewish scholars are going to translate the Bible into Greek. The social status of the upper class Greek women are going to improve. They can move about freely, learn how to read and write, have certain jobs. Commoner status is not going to improve too much. So 3 systems of thought from these Hellenistic philosophers: Cynicism, Epicureanism, and Stoicism. So Cynicism is when you live simply and you avoid materialism. Epicureanism is to accept the world as it is, avoid politics, and live simply. I think we could all learn from that today in our day and time. And Stoicism is to ignore emotions and to follow reason. So when you call someone stoic, they're just very emotionless, and it comes from that word. Art is often going to show people in the grip of emotion, so a lot of emotion shown in their art, and they write comedies about everyday life. They're going to perform experiments and develop new theories. Eratosthenes estimated the circumference of the earth within 1%. They dissected corpses to learn about human anatomy and learn how to use drugs to relieve pain, so they're highly advanced. In science, medicine, and math, Euclid is going to organize a book about geometry. So you can thank Euclid for having your geometry class today. And Archimedes, if you've heard the Archimedes screw, Archimedes invents a compound pulley used for lifting heavy objects, and also the cylinder screw, which is named after him, that's used in irrigation.